Hi, we're back again for another sew along. This is going to be a quick one, and again it's using the new Ella pattern. It's amazing how something so simple can be done so many different ways. So what you'll need for today is the only pattern piece you'll need out of Ella is the Ella back. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a really sweet sundress that will be gathered in the front and back, and then no sleeves but just ties at the shoulder. And I'm going to show you two ways to do it. One way is just where the front and back are gathered onto a bias band, and the other way you're actually going to be able to smock, just a little bit of smocking on the back and on the front. So let's get started. So let's get started with just the gathered version of this Ella. And what you'll need to do is, like I said, all you'll need is your back. The only difference between the front and the back is the front neckline slightly curves down. And with the way this fits and the way it's tied at the shoulders, you really just need the back pattern piece for this, and you'll use it for both the front and back. So the first thing you're going to do, in fact, the only thing you're going to do with this pattern piece is you are going to move down the cutting line at the top 2.5 inches. So I'm just going to measure from the top 2.5 inches and make a mark right here. And then I'm just going to fold it down. So if you wanted to, at this point, trace your pattern and make a new Ella pattern, and you can label it Ella sundress or Ella tie on the shoulder sundress, you could do that, or you could just stop right there, which is what I did. And so then what you would do is you will cut out both of your front and your back out of this one pattern piece. Easy, right? So after you do that, then we can just put this pattern piece away, and we're going to talk about a few other things that you're going to need. So I wanted my strip that goes across the top and the bands that come around the armhole and tie on the shoulder. I wanted those to be a contrasting fabric. So in your PDF that you'll find on the blog will be measurements on what you need for your size for the band that goes across the top, and also for the length of the long ties. So for this size, I needed 5 and, here they are, 5.75 inch long strips for the front and the back. And no matter what size you're making, those strips are going to be 1.25 inches wide. So once you have cut your strips 1.25 inches wide, and you have a front and you have a back, then you'll also need some long strips for the ties. So these need to be cut on the bias, and to get a strip this long, you would probably need almost 1 yard of fabric. So we don't want to do that. But if you get just 1/2 yard, that will be enough to do half the length you need for these long strips, and then just sew them so that this one seam will actually be at the side seam of the underarm. So it isn't something that's going to be obvious. And if you don't have 1/2 yard, maybe you're just using some scraps from at home, just do that. You may have to piece it maybe one more time, and you'll see by the time these are stitched and folded and tied, you're just not going to see that seam anyway. So whether you buy something specifically for this or whether you just use scraps, super easy to do. So what I did is I did cut my strips and I did sew them together for my long strips, and you'll have measurements in your PDF that'll tell you exactly how long you need for the size you're making. And like I said, no matter what size, the width is going to be 1.25 inches. So I've got those strips ready, and then what I've done is along the top I put 2 rows of gathering threads. And for this, I like to use a length of more like 3.5. And the reason for that is, as I start gathering, because this isn't super full, it's easy sometimes for those gathers to wiggle and move around. And if you've got a little tighter stitch length, they're not as likely to do that. So that's what I did with this. Instead of a length of 4, which is usually what we use. I just did a 3.5 so that my stitches would be a little closer together and my gathers would be a little tighter. So after you get this gathered to the length of your short strips, then you'll be ready to sew those short strips on. Actually, one more thing before you do that, go ahead and press each long edge of your strips to the center of the band. And you'll do that with your long strips too. So, and it's just easier to do it now before it's actually sewn on. So after you've done that, then you're going to sew the band on the front and the back of your dress. And what you're going to do is you're going to sew the right side of the band to the wrong side of the dress. Okay, so it's a little different. And the reason we're going to do this is we just want a really quick project. So instead of sewing it right sides together, flipping it, and then whipping it down by hand, if you do it this way, and then just, there'll be a few places you might need to trim. But then you're going to refold this band so that it now folds to the front like that. And you can put a few pins in there. And then I like using an edge stitch foot for this, and I can sew right along that folded edge. So I'm going to get that done, and after you've got your top bands on both your front and back, we'll be back to do the next step. So the next thing we'll be ready for is stitching the long strips to the armhole. So what you'll need to do is find the seam where you sewed the two strips together to make your really long strip for the straps, and put that seam so that it's the right side of the band to the wrong side of the armhole, right at the side seam. And then just continue pinning. Till you get to the top of the armhole. So this is the right side of the band to the wrong side of the dress fabric. And then this is just a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and you're actually just stitching in the crease where you folded those long edges. Okay, so now what I want you to do, get this out of the way a little bit. You may need to trim that seam allowance just a little bit. You don't want to trim it a lot, because when you fold the bias band around the seam allowance, you want the seam allowance to fill up all of that folded bias band space. So after you've done a little trimming, flip it over, and now you're going to fold the bias band to the front, just like we did at the top. And then either with your regular foot or with an edge stitch foot, you're going to stitch this down. But instead of just starting at the armhole where we sewed the tie to the armhole, start sewing at the very end. So you'll go ahead and refold what you've pressed, and then you'll fold it again, and you can either press that or just hold it in place. And you may want to put a few pins, because what you'll be doing is you'll be sewing just right at that edge, sewing those two folded edges together. And you'll continue that. Then when you get to the part where the armhole is, you'll just continue stitching right along the edge of that folded bias band all the way until you get to the other side. Now I've gone ahead and done it on this side. And then what I like to do is I like to just tie a knot in the end of these. It adds a little weight to it, and I think it just makes the bow and the streamers hang nicely. And because this is on the bias, you don't have to worry about these edges fraying because it's a bias. So you can see how cute this is going to be. And at the end of the sew along, I'll show you this one as well as the Smocked one that we're going to be doing next, which is the one I'm really excited about. But this is great. Just if you just want to whip one of these out for a swimsuit cover-up, that it would be sweet for a beach picture or just some fun, super cool summer dress. So let's get started on the Smocked view. Okay, so let's talk about the Smocked view for a second. For this one, you really should go ahead and trace your Ella pattern. And again, just like with the Unsmocked view, you're going to fold down the top 2.5 inches. And then what I did is I went ahead and put my tissue paper on top and traced it. So you can see my line here and then my line for the armhole and side seam. And then you are going to have some numbers on your handout or on your PDF or just looking on the blog if you don't even want to print it off. And I have gone ahead and done the math for you to figure out how much fullness you need to add for this to be smocked. And so what I did is I took the length of your band, and everybody will have their own length depending on the size, and I multiplied that by 3. And that number is what I used then to tell you where to measure from and how far out to measure. So like I said, I did the math for you, so just look at your chart. But what you need to remember is when you're measuring, and I think this one was like 17.5 inches, that's 17.5 inches from the top of the armhole curve. So not from the place on fold line, but all the way over to the top of the armhole curve. I measured over, like I said, I think it was about 17.5 inches. So you'll look on your chart and get that number, and then just remember that you're measuring from the top of the armhole curve all the way out that length. And that's going to be your new place on fold line. So once you have done that, then you are ready to cut out your fabric. Now, when I'm going to be pleating something that has an armhole curve in it, I like to go ahead and keep my fabric pretty much straight here. It's just, if you've ever pleated before, you know how much easier it is to start when you have a straight edge than to start when you have a curved edge. So whether you're doing your pleating yourself or leaving it for someone else to pleat, if you can remember to do that, it just makes the one behind the pleater a lot happier. But if you forget, it's still very doable. So that's what I've done, is I've gone ahead and drawn the armhole curve and then just extended this straight line out here and down to where the side seam starts, so that when I did my pleating, I had a nice straight edge there to start. So, and I marked that armhole curve on both sides. And then after it's pleated, when you get it back, it'll look like this. And so what you'll need to do is you'll need to go ahead and clip the threads. And then I like using the eye of a needle to pull these the pleater threads out. I can find one real quick here. So, and what you'll need to do is you will need to allow yourself a 1/4 of an inch for a seam allowance. So rather than just pulling the pleats out right at the armhole curve, pull your pleater threads out 1 pleat past the armhole curve. So you're giving yourself about a 1/4 of an inch of a seam allowance. And sometimes it's 1 pleat and sometimes it's 2 pleats over. So once you've done that, then you're just going to tie off those threads 2 to 3 at a time. Now this is a size 4 and I have put 7 rows of pleater threads. You can do as many or as little as you want, but because this is smocked both front and back, I didn't want to do too many rows. This is a great project if you can get it all together before you go on a little road trip. This is a fun project to just smock in the car or at the beach. So once you get one side of the threads tied off, then you can move to the other side and do the same thing. Also, it's at this point that you would go ahead then and go ahead and cut that armhole curve out. Okay, so now we'll move to the other side and do the very same thing. Got one thread here that's a light pink. It's not as easy to see as these darker colors are. Okay, so now before I tie off these threads, I'm going to get my lace shaping board out. I'm going to go ahead and just gather this up quite a bit. And then I'll pull this back out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut my tails off here just to get them out of the way. And then on one side, the side that I've got tied off here and the pleats pulled real tight to, I'm just going to pin this to my lace board. And then what you'll need is you'll need your strip that you've cut for the top of your dress, and just lay it right here, and you can go ahead and actually pin it down too so it doesn't move. And then you're going to start tying these threads off. My iron going off there. So once you get that armhole curve right here at the bottom, at the end of your band for the top, once you have that right there, go ahead and put some pins so it doesn't move. And then you can start tying off on that side. So at this point, you could go ahead and do your smocking. Now this first row at the very top, this pleater row at the top is a holding row, and typically the one at the bottom is a holding row too. So for this project, I would only be smocking approximately 5 rows. And you could do just a simple little geometric, or you could do actually do a little bit of picture smocking right through here. So I need to cut my other armhole away. So what we're going to do next is, I have one piece, one side already smocked. Actually, I think I have maybe a few more leaves to put in here. But basically, it's already smocked. So we're going to talk about doing this 2 ways. One is with your smocking already done, ready to do the construction. And then the other one will be, I'll be showing you how to do a ready to smock. So get everything together and we'll start talking about that. Okay, now we're ready to prepare the top of the dress so that we can sew the those bands at the top of the smocking or just the pleated fabric like we did on just the gathered fabric. So what you'll need for this is called tiger tape, and it's just 1/4 of an inch wide, which is perfect because that's the seam allowance we have. And it is sticky. It's going to stick to the fabric, but it won't leave a residue when we pull it off. So what I'm going to do is just place this tape so that there's just enough room between the edge of the tape and that first cable row for my machine needle. So we're just going to stitch right between the tape and that row of cables. So the stitch length for this needs to be shorter because we really want to secure those pleats and keep everything nice and even through there. So the best way to do that is to lower your stitch length to 1.5. And then you're going to stitch just right between the cable and the tape. Now, what I've done for the front or the back that isn't smocked yet, I've put 2 rows of tape here, and those 2 rows are at the second pleater thread, because remember the top row is just a holding thread, so it's going to go away. But this is where your first row of smocking will be, so that's where we want to stitch, is in between those 2 pieces of tape. So I've actually already done that on this one, and so now I can trim this extra fabric away right up next to that edge of the tape. And the reason I use 2 rows of tape here is because it holds the pleats in place and keeps them from getting smushed to one side or the other as you're stitching. So in just a second, we're actually going to pull away both rows of tape. So now what you have is you have a seam with a really tiny stitch length, and you have an exact 1/4 of an inch just above that stitching. So now what we'll do is we'll take one of your bands that you've cut, and again it's going to go on the wrong side, but you're going to be sewing from the right side. And the reason for that is so that you can follow that stitching line. So you do want to use several pins because you don't want this band to slip while you're stitching, because you won't be able to see it. It'll be underneath. So this one I haven't stitched yet, so I'm going to stitch along here in between the cable and that edge of the tape. Then I'm going to trim away this excess fabric at the top, and then I'll do the very same thing. I will pin the band for that one at the on the back with the wrong side, with the right side of the band facing the wrong side of the dress, just right along that top edge. So after I stitch here that short length, I'll trim that extra fabric off and then take that tape away just like I did on this one. So I'll get these stitched on, and then we'll be ready to talk about the next step. Okay, I finished up the top of one of the already smocked side, and have top stitched it down just like we did for the unsmocked version of Ella. And now I'm ready to go ahead and top stitch the band down here, and then this is ready to smock, whether I do it now or after everything is constructed. So I'm going to finish up, and then I'll be back to show you the finished project. Well, whether smocked or unsmocked, I hope you've enjoyed this Ella sundress, and we love seeing your creations, so we hope to see them out there real soon. Bye-bye.